Compliment is poison. This is an old Chinese proverb, and it's meant to infer that, especially coming from management, it's the poison for an employee. You compliment an employee when you're management, and the employee starts to think, oh, wow, I got a compliment, and suddenly I'm like the man, and I deserve a raise, and I deserve a promotion, and I deserve this, that, and the other thing. And pretty soon the guy just winds up getting fired. Well, unfortunately, the inverse is just as true. If management insults someone else, like specifically an employee, not a very good thing, right? When Jack Kirby was at National Publishing Comics, which was the predecessor to DC Comics, wasn't happy. He had no reason to be happy. Didn't get along very well with the editorial staff at all. And unfortunately, this is the kind of thing that pretty much every artist, and if not all, then almost all writers will tell you. Editing is where the big problems come in. These are the guys they feel the need to justify their job. So they make cuts, they do whatever, and they nitpick. They have to nitpick, right? It shows that they're smart and you're dumb and whatever. And turned out to be dumb all around because it caused Jack Kirby to wind up leaving. He was working on a project called Sky Masters of the Space Force. He'd gotten that gig by an editor named Jack Schiff. Now, this guy had turned around and sued Kirby much later on, and successfully so. Sued him in the sense that he said, hey, I got him that job, so I deserve some kind of commission, some kind of royalty, some kind of finder's fee, recommendations fee. And he sued Jack for that. I don't know the details of the case. I'm not a lawyer, all right? I'm a few things, but I'm certainly not a lawyer. I don't know how exactly that worked, and it was just really messed up, is what it was. But either way, Jack got sued, and some of the other editors over at National weren't kind to Jack at all. It's just one of those kind of things. You want to say, oh, they couldn't recognize greatness. Yeah, I'm going to say that because I'm a fan of Jack's, but it is what it is. At the end of the day, the things that they nitpicked him for were silly. They said that he didn't draw the shoelaces on a cavalryman's boots, and he didn't draw a Native American getting on a horse the correct way, and various other complaints like this. Now, maybe some people would see, oh yeah, okay, this is a big deal. Maybe if it was something that had to do with continuity, but for the most part, it wasn't a big deal. And this is where I'm going to get into Jack's style, because Jack Kirby essentially was the famous Marvel method that is boasted so often. Jack was not a guy who would draw for details. In fact, he would draw for motion. He would draw for maneuverability. He would draw to show impact. A lot like I would point out on my Incredible Hulk videos about Sal Buscema. When you see a Sal Buscema comic, specifically the Hulk ones especially, right? You're going to see action. You're going to see somebody get socked in the face and just go flying in the most incredible ways to make you go, eee, that clearly hurt. Jack was able to do that and so much more. Jack didn't care so much about the way that it looked in a certain sense. A lot of people, when they first see Jack's art, they'll say, oh, it's blocky, it's chunky, they look like blobs, the people. He wasn't worried about that. He was worried about the action. He was worried about the motion and the fluidity. And he pulled it off in a way that if you were able to look at Jack's work in an abstract sense, all right, similar to the way that you would look at, let's say, a Picasso. All right, yes, I'm going there. You could see that Jack's work was so much more than just all the little details on different things. That's the stuff that took forever. That's the stuff that made it so the comics wouldn't get produced as fast. Jack was about getting it done fast, and making it look amazing. Not necessarily about the details. So Jack eventually got fed up and he quit. He quit National and he went over to Atlas. He did a few different little jobs here and there. He worked for Archie Comics. He did a bunch of things. But this was the time. He goes to work for Atlas, and it transitions into Marvel Comics. And this was the time. Stan Lee recognized immediately what this guy was capable of doing, all the beauty he was capable of creating, and he made the Marvel method, which was essentially the Jack Kirby method. It was so important for them to stylize what they did and what all the other artists would do, with the exception of Gene Colan. I'll do a video on him. It's worth it. That Jack would often do little layouts that the artist for a comic who, if Jack didn't actually draw that comic, another artist would come along and they would take these Jack Kirby layouts and they would draw their own pencils over top of the layouts. This would help them be done faster, and this would help them be in a uniform standard, even though the art could look very different. But it would get it so that Marvel had a specific style, and Stan Lee decided, and his superiors approved, that Jack should be the standard for the Marvel method. And this was the time. The Fantastic Four and Thor, later on the Hulk. He even worked on Spider-Man. He did the original story for Spider-Man. Due to time constraints, he wasn't able to complete it, and Stan Lee wanted to bring it over to Steve Ditko. It's a good thing and a bad thing that he did. And we'll get into that when I do a Steve Ditko video or a Spider-Man video, but yeah. Either way, he was instrumental on the X-Men, the original X-Men, Magneto, Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. He did so many of these incredible characters that they wouldn't have been made without him, and they wouldn't have had that feel, that original look, if it wasn't for him. When you look at Marvel Comics today, you are still looking at Jack Kirby, because he made pretty much all of those characters. The way that you see them, that's what you see when you look at them today. But basically what it comes down to is that Marvel made their money. They made this amazing wallop and actually became a real powerhouse competitor to what became DC Comics because of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Now, not everything is meant to last, right? He worked there for about a decade. During that time, a big problem had arisen. Captain America was due for a renewal of license, of copyright, and Joe Simon came along and said that he's going to renew for sole copyright ownership of Captain America. This wasn't cool. Not by any standard, not by any means, not by any stretch of the imagination. This was a real dick move. Absolutely unacceptable. And of course, Marvel decides to take them to court, because then they can't use Captain America, or they have to pay Joe Simon. And more importantly, the freelance artist, Jack Kirby, who was working for Marvel at the time, he was the co-creator, and he doesn't get the copyright license on that. So Marvel sued and had Jack help out with it. And the way that they were able to acquire license to Captain America was because Jack Kirby, as the co-creator, said, yeah, this should go to Marvel. It was done for Marvel. It was done for Marvel specifically. They should be able to have the copyright and renew it in their name. And maybe it was kind of a way of getting back at Joe. The details of that, not particularly clear. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so it is what it is. And eventually that turned out into its own bad thing, because Jack wanted more than what he was given. Now that the litigation was done, that was in 68 and 69. Now that that was out of the way, Jack wound up having his own problems, his own dilemma. He wasn't as business savvy as Joe Simon, but he did still know that the work that he'd done, the work that he'd created, he wanted the originals back. And they didn't give him back the originals. They said that they can't do that. It's not in their policy. They wanted sole ownership, and that kind of wasn't cool. He wanted credit for the things that he did. He wanted more money for what he did. He wanted license. He wanted royalties. And maybe I'm getting some of the terminology wrong. I'm not a lawyer, and my business practices don't include working for publishers and the like. So this is out of my field, and this is only what I've read and seen and heard online. But at the end of the day, Marvel wasn't able to give Jack anything that he asked for. And realistically, he didn't ask for a lot. And I don't say that with bias. I say that with the fact that today, artists do get everything that Jack had originally asked for back in the day. Jack was kind of a futurist, you know, like they say that Tony Stark is in the comics. Jack was a real person. Jack was really a futurist. He wrote about the atomic bomb 2 years before it happened because he read an article about Nikola Tesla. And by reading this and seeing this atomic physicist doing these amazing things and whatnot, he dreamt up the idea that someone was going to weaponize that. And they did. And 2 years before Nagasaki and Hiroshima, he made a story. He actually got an inquiry by the FBI about it. He was annoyed and wrote it off and whatever, and cleared of any kind of spying charges or anything along those lines. But yeah, he imagined a lot in the future. He imagined diversity in the comics. He was the first person to make an actual superhero who was black. We're talking about Black Panther. There have been black people in comics before. Africans, African Americans, there have. But they weren't superheroes. You're talking about a cowboy, you know, a black cowboy, and things along those lines. But for the most part, they were widely comical, not things that we, by today's standards, would find funny. Back then, that was considered funny. I'm not going to get into the politics of it. But at the end of the day, he drew an actual superhero. He created this superhero in Black Panther. I will do a Black Panther video. Hell or high water, that's happening. And whew, an amazing character, absolutely amazing character. He made Wakanda, which was a technologically superior country to all other countries. Jack did that. While still keeping their African heritage, Jack was able to do that. This is something that was simply unheard of before. When most other people would try and draw a black character as any kind of a hero, it would be canceled or boycotted. One of these days I'm going to have to do a video on that. I'm going to have to. But these are the kind of things that Jack foresaw. He knew that racism simply could not last in the world, and comics was one of the ways that he would do it. And Stan Lee, too. He was always trying to be at the forefront of things. As the Civil War movement starts happening, and he's able to recognize a good thing when he sees it. Jack was able to see it before anybody else, it seemed, would see it. And he would draw it, and he would create it, he would put it down in print. So Jack wanted what eventually every comic book creator to this day gets, but they weren't willing to give it to him back then. And to side with Marvel just a teensy bit, they were still in their infancy. They weren't making a whole lot of money, but it is what it is. That was one of the reasons why Jack Kirby eventually left Marvel at the end of the 70s. Excuse me, at the end of the 60s. The other reason is because of Stan Lee. I say that in a very blanket term, but the nuances of it are much more detailed than that. It's not necessarily that Stan Lee ever did anything directly to Jack. Jack had been pushed around a lot. A whole lot. You know, he's seen Joe Simon rise to really cool things pretty much without him. You know, he'd seen all these other people rise to great things without him, and work that he'd done sitting down in his home, or not even in his home at first, being in these offices and slaving over these drawings, things coming from his mind, being put onto paper, these stories that eventually other people would basically just fill in words, you know, to make a slightly different story, or something along those lines, based on what Jack had done so readily. And he just really wasn't getting, he was getting about $35,000 a year. That's nothing to balk about back in the 60s, right? That's good money. But there are people today who don't make $35,000 a year. So back in the 60s, that's a really good hefty chunk of change. But at the end of the day, he wanted more, and he deserved more. He deserved a whole lot more. When the entire company is basically built on the man's back, he deserved a lot more. But Marvel simply wasn't really capable. They didn't put enough emphasis into it. They didn't realize what they necessarily had when they had it. And that's just the way it is. And they didn't realize what they were capable of doing. They weren't the most business savvy. But Stan Lee got the blame for a lot of that. Because usually whenever Stan Lee spoke, bang, it happens. If Stan Lee were to say, hey man, I'm going to hire you for this much money, you got hired for that much money. But that stuff had to be approved on the outside, above him. So from outside of the box, it looked like Stan Lee was in charge of everything, but he wasn't. He simply wasn't. He wasn't the owner. If that were the case, he never would have left. Why would you ever leave a place like Marvel Comics if you owned Marvel Comics? So he wasn't the owner. He didn't have final say. He didn't have carte blanche to do whatever he wanted to do. And also, Jack, somewhat admittedly, has stated that he was a bit jealous of Stan Lee, in the sense that Stan Lee kept getting all the attention. And I mean, that's what Stan Lee did. He's a showman. He goes out there. He's always wanted to be a thespian. And he goes out and he's doing press tours, and he's getting his name in things and his voice in cartoons and things like that. I mean, you know, gets to move out to California and all these different things. And Jack felt that Stan Lee should have helped him to move forward also. Maybe should have, maybe shouldn't have. I wasn't there. I wasn't involved. I guess I'm entitled to a bit of an opinion, but I'm not even going to give that, because I don't really have an opinion on it. It has nothing to do with me. I'm simply relaying what I know. So, took about 2 years, around 1970 into 71, that in 1971, Jack went back to DC Comics.